Hello and welcome to Context. If this is your first time, thank you for joining us. And if you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing. And I know that we are going to have a great time learning and equipping so that we can live our best life for Jesus in our context. Have you been hurt in a multicultural church? Is that even possible? If it is, what are some of the causes and remedies, and how can we prevent future hurt from transpiring again? That is what we are discussing in today's episode with our expert guest. Of course, we can all agree that as South Africans, we live in a racialized country with centuries and centuries of racial hurt, of which most people have not completely healed from. And so navigating the waters of any multicultural space can prove tricky, both for the individual and the church as a whole. This week we speak to our expert guest, Jennie Tsekwa, who has devoted her entire life to helping organizations and people deal with these issues. Jennie was born in the United States and grew up in Malaysia and the Philippines and moved to South Africa in 2006 to do her master's degree in diversity studies at the University of Cape Town. Originally trained as a journalist, she loves exploring how stories shape our lives, collectively and individually. She's an experienced facilitator and coach with a passion for working with individuals and teams who are going through sessions of change, growth, or stress, and seeking greater alignment, connection, and effectiveness. She has been working in the field of diversity and inclusion since 2001. And I know most of our listeners were actually born after 2001, some of them. But she's been doing this since 2001 in the public, corporate, and non-profit sectors. Jennie lives in Johannesburg with her husband, where they are raising their three sons in a bilingual English and Sesotho home. Jennie is a co-founder, director, and lead facilitator in Kopanya, working directly with clients and their teams, as well as leading Kopanya's work in schools. And ladies and gentlemen, you would have heard that I've been mentioning Jennie. Her name is Jennie Tsekwa. Jennie Tsekwa, good day. Hello, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Temba, and greetings to all the listeners. This is a real privilege to be on this podcast, to be looking at this important topic. So thank you, Temba. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Whilst we affirm that multicultural spaces are God-glorifying, now we live in a racialized country, as I've previously alluded to, and this can what can ensue or can happen often is the issue of hurt. Tell us some of the hurts that cultural spaces may inflict on people.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Temba. And it's so interesting when, maybe just as a side note, as we start, as soon as you approached me about this topic, and this has happened to me so many times in this work, it's like the talk coincides with these things happening in real time. And so sometimes it's actually hard to separate the professional work in this area from the personal.
Sure.
And I think that plays out in churches, with church leaders, with leaders in other spiritual spaces. I've also had the privilege of working in several faith-based organizations, and I see that happening, that these hurts that you allude to are happening at the same time as leaders, co-workers, colleagues needing to deliver on their work. And that's part of the challenge, is attending to the personal while at the same time continuing the work, continuing in God's mission, continuing in what needs to be done in the world.
Sure.
And so some of the hurts that I've certainly had many conversations with people about, some, and I'll kind of, for the sake of full transparency, that I've been on the receiving end of myself. So I don't remove my own self from this picture. But it can certainly come quite overtly through actually direct comments and words.
Sure.
So words, are powerful tool to either build up or to break down. And I think, thank goodness, the Bible gives us so many guidelines around the power of our words. And yet, as human beings, we still have a long way to go in our journeys around how we use those words. And sometimes it's intentional. It's not always just unintentional. So sometimes people come to me and say, no, I'm pretty sure the person didn't mean what they said.
Sure.
Now, the painful thing is sometimes the words actually, they are meant what they did mean what they said. And then I think later on we'll get to the topic of then how do we, restore or reconcile. But yeah, so words certainly, but there's a lot more subtle things besides words that cause this hurt. Sometimes it's tone.
Sure.
I've been in many conversations with church leaders, church members, where that is tricky to then put your finger on. And yet someone, if we think of our own experiences, you can feel when someone's talking down to you.
Sure.
Whether from a race perspective, whether from a gender perspective, or many other aspects of diversity. But tone is huge. A few others, as I was thinking about this topic, are symbols in religious spaces that can continue to cause hurt or harm. So, for example, if, I grew up in a church where all the images of Jesus were white, blue-eyed,
sure,
blonde hair, and so given, the history and the context in South Africa where that was held up as an ideal of beauty, it can cause hurt even to have those symbols of whiteness embedded within religious kind of imagery. And then I think that corresponds with another area, which is just the invisibilizing then of marginalized experiences, of other representations, forgetting people, mixing people up, forgetting names. All those things lead to people feeling like they're invisible in a space. And then a few others, as I was just reflecting on this, would be when one of these things maybe tries to get raised, it's joked about instead of being taken on board. And I know jokes carry a lot of cultural connotation, like some joking is done to kind of relieve stress. And yet jokes can be really, really hurtful. And also kind of other throwaway comments I've often heard in the South African context, but true in other parts of the world as well. Comments like, well, can't we just move on? And so, something like, can't we just move on from the past? That can hit really, really hard and really painfully if someone's whole life and current reality is still affected by that particular past. Yeah, there's a few others. Should I keep going, or do you want to add to any of those? A lot.
I'm just loving the clarity with which you are packaging these, and I'm tempted to ask you and say, why can't we just move on? Why can't we, as people say, guys, let's just move on? Why are we stuck in the past?
Yeah. And maybe maybe I'll actually go there, Temba, because it's interesting. As soon as you approach me with the topic of healing, how can we heal from these hurts? I'll be honest, the very first thing that came to my mind, because of the work and some of the spaces I'm in at the moment, is the first thought that ran through my mind, and this is not going to sound very optimistic or hopeful, but I'm just being real, is I actually thought, I don't know if healing is possible.
Sure.
And then I asked myself, well, why am I in that space mentally, emotionally? And then I thought, well, maybe that's partly where we're getting things wrong. Talking of healing while the very things that cause the wounds are still wounding. Sure. So you ask like this, why can't we move on? Because we can't move on from a current infliction.
Right.
I'll give two examples. So one of my sons came to me the other day and he said, Mommy, I have a splinter in my foot. Kids often running around barefoot. And I looked and I couldn't find the splinter. And I said, maybe it's come out. Maybe it's just the remaining kind of wound from it. And he came back a few days later and he's like, no, Mommy, my foot is still sore. It must still be there. And I said, okay, this is going to hurt, but I'm going to need to get a needle and dig around a little bit and see if I can see it. And sure enough, he was spot on. But that splinter, it was a tiny, tiny thorn. You could hardly even see it. It was minuscule. And yet that thing was continuing to cause pain in his foot. And so I use that as a metaphor that we can't move on. If you even use the metaphor of him walking, he can't move on without that pain if the root of what's causing it hasn't been taken out or at least acknowledged. And so that's why I say moving on makes it sound like these things are something of the past, and yet they're being reinscribed, they're being done over and over again, or they've kind of been embedded in our systems in a way, and almost like a splinter needs to be carefully extracted. The second example I wanted to share, so that's kind of, for me, a metaphor of something quite tiny that can cause someone to not even...
Ongoing hurt.
Yeah, ongoing hurt. But something that I've really been sitting with, maybe we can come back to later, which is the issue of bigger forms of trauma, and why also the phrase "can't we move on" just doesn't work when you take trauma into consideration. So someone very dear to me in my life, who's been through, as a family, they've been through significant amount of trauma, loss, and other emotional abuse and other forms of trauma. Received feedback from a therapist who'd been working with them as a family, especially working with the kids. And this therapist actually came to the parent who was involved, said to the parent, "I'm sorry, but actually the therapy that I'm working with your children on at the moment, it actually won't take effect. It won't work because they're in a current state of trauma.
Sure.
They're being re-traumatized. And so trauma therapies can't work if a person is in a current state of trauma."
Sure.
So that's, again, why we can't be too quick to say move on without recognizing what is the root.
Sure. Yeah. Wow, that's so helpful. Just the whole concept of ongoing pain, I think we understand it. Oftentimes it's easy to understand it, and I'm glad you're using those metaphors which we can so easily, readily relate to, like actual physical pain. Yeah. But I guess the challenge with racial or cultural hurt is that it is so invisible.
Yeah.
And it's not something that is tangible. And even the person feeling the pain, sometimes even articulating what it is that they are feeling and how it came about, it's such a complex thing to a point where, generally speaking, we go to a church, right? We love God, we love Christ. We are sanctified by the blood of Jesus Christ. We are imperfect human beings. And so there is just an inherent proclivity for everyone to hurt everyone in a way. But the challenge, though, in a racialized space is that generally we'll say, but hey, move on because, it's expected that we're going to be hurting each other and that type of thing within, even when it comes to a racialized space. And so now, whilst it is easy when somebody is stabbed and everyone cannot say, we are sanctified, forget and don't worry about the blood that is coming down the right of your rib. People will be like, let's put a bandage, let's take you to hospital, let's send you flowers. And the guy that is doing it, if they truly repentant and they truly love God, initially when they see the blood splatter on the floor, they will, one, come and ask for forgiveness and see, and not just look and say, I've just asked for forgiveness, I'm moving on, but they will go and say, can I give you a bandage? Can I call 911? Or okay, in South Africa, 10-111. See, I watch a lot of movies. But anyways, let's call, emergency services to come and help you get some help. That would be an appropriate response. And nobody will see a contradiction in that. But when it comes to cultural things, one, even the person saying that was hurtful to me, it can so often easily be misconstrued for an unforgiving heart. You just, you're not forgiving and all that kind of stuff. And very few times we pay attention to the person doing the hurting and saying, dude, do you understand the ramifications of what you've just done? And oftentimes they'll say, but no, I'm not the one who inflicted, when we talk about the systemic racial or cultural stuff, I'm not the author of the systemic injustice. And therefore, whatever hurt that I do, I can't bear the blame for it. And we get lost in trying to pontificate and explain away and defend and never get into actually isolating the problem and helping the person that is offended. And it is obviously like, I feel like I've just described the problem without coming with a solution, as it were. But I think there's still more to it. What are some of the barriers, to healing, or the barriers for us to actually be able to crystallize what exactly is happening?
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that, Tim, because I actually think that is part of the problem, is actually we quick to run past the diagnosis and get caught up in who's to blame. It wasn't my intention.
Right.
You're just being re-triggered from past experiences. So we get all tied up around that rather than having a language to describe, but what's actually happened in this moment and to correctly diagnose it. And I know for me, that's, and again, I'm not going to jump too quickly to kind of solutions now, but just to speak in relation to what you were saying just now, is that actually having the language to describe, just like doctors need a lot of terminology to describe and diagnose correctly various inflictions or harm that's been caused, I think we need to expand our literacy, our language around these things, and then it doesn't, and not become so defensive about it.
Right.
So that if someone has done something hurtful, we have words for it. So some examples that I know have helped me in my journey has been even the notion of internalized superiority.
Sure.
That I can carry this internalized superiority, and that can be hurtful to people. That then I understand, oh, why was my tone hurtful? Not because I intended it to be, but because I carry this from my conditioning as a person in this light skin, as a white person, that superiority can come out when I least suspect it.
Sure.
And so if I have that language to understand, then when someone gives me feedback like, "Sure, Jennie, your tone with me was quite patronizing,"
Sure.
then I can recognize that there's a validity in that, what that person has just said, because I have a terminology and understanding what they've been able to give me feedback on. And a few of the other ones around that have been helpful is just, and another, going back to your first question around what are some of the hurts caused, is also policing of emotions.
Sure.
That causes a lot of harm, is when I can say to you, "Oh, you're getting too worked up about this. Can't you just calm down?" So as soon as I had a language in my head and someone explained to me, like, what does policing of other people's emotions actually mean? Then I'm like, whoa, okay. Sure. So I need to be conscious of when I'm doing that actually, kind of deviates from the matter at hand. What is the hurt itself? And other forms, I mean, just sure, again, as I was making notes about this, just what are the ongoing hurts, inequitable resources in the church space. Sure. I mean, we saying, at the same time, we want to embrace and be the body of Christ as a church body, and we want to have people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. But what if 10 years go by and people are still stuck in those same places? Sure. That's why I say that's the splinter that hasn't been removed. That's an ongoing hurt, or a callousness towards poverty.
Sure.
That I've heard. I mean, I won't go into some examples, but some of the things, and again, we need to, like I say, I need to be courageous to speak up when I hear those things, because sometimes if we're at the same either socioeconomic status, or maybe we have the same gender or same race, we can say things to each other that we would never say in mixed company. Sure. So I've had some white people, and I'm not generalizing here, but I've had some things said to me that I'm like, sure, would you ever say that in front of a person of color?
Sure.
So I think that's why the hurts perpetuate, because we need a shared language that we can use to identify and then properly diagnose the problem before we then get into, okay, now what needs to be done, whether it's asking forgiveness, some of the things you've mentioned, making amends. I'll pause there for a moment.
Sure. That's good. And challenging at the same time. It's rich in like in helping and equipping, just to be able to unpack it the way you're unpacking it. And I think the challenge, though, is that I think we get into a space where safe space, that language of safe space is used quite often, that, we need a safe space to be able to engage with this stuff. And I do still want to hyperlink back to the hurt and like just the complexity of actually even communicating, in the absence of the language. You are up the creek without a paddle, without the language to communicate it, over and above that your emotions get policed and so on. Now, on the policing of emotions, I want to link this thing of safe space. Yeah. That now, can we get into these safe spaces, both sides, where we try to, we use the safe space as a haven for bigotry, where it's like, like the reason why white people speak the way they speak, however insensitive, and vice versa, is because that's a safe space. And my safe space gives me license to actually spew out any sort of racially insensitive thing, because that's actually what I think it is. I really do think that the nanny that wakes up every day at 3 a.m. in the morning in a shack and takes 3 taxis to go to work and knocks off at 6 and only gets home at 9 p.m. is in the situation they're in because, one, they are lazy.
Sure.
If not, it's their government that is causing the perpetuation, and therefore, why should I even bother to even consider poverty in that way?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure, Tema. Yeah. What you've touched on now is it's incredibly hard to I think create a safe space without first taking a few steps back from that so-called safe space and saying, actually, what are some of the guidelines? What is going to guide us in that space? In the work we do, we've tried to move away from the term ground rules because the term rules always begs the question, well, who sets the rules and on whose terms? But I think that's an important question to ask. Is it safe on whose terms? And it's safe for who?
Sure.
Who is it safe for? And what is going to create that safety? So we've found ourselves in many spaces and conversations that have asked us, like, how do we create a safe space? Because we want people to be able to speak up. We want people to be able to share, speak their mind, not fear judgment on all sides.
Sure.
And so then it's more about, then let's define that safe space. What does it mean to have a space of non-judgment, but also a space of accountability?
Sure.
A space where if I say something, I'm asking for feedback. So give me feedback on what I'm saying.
Sure.
Without me getting defensive. So we often find ourselves taking teams through, before we can ever claim a space is safe, we find that it's helpful to talk through what are some of the elements that make it safe. And like I said, and for who? And we've even become more cautious to say, is it safe enough to have the conversation? Because no space can ever be completely safe. We are humans. We are, like you said at the beginning, we are bound to hurt each other. And then, in fact, I was with a group recently at a school where we were coming back for a second round of the conversation. And they actually said, no, we need to now re-contract around this safe space because half the group is not feeling safe anymore.
Wow.
And so we pause the whole process and say, that's actually where we need to focus in. What has broken the trust? What has caused the safety or sense of safety to break down? And rather than kind of rushing on our list of agenda points, okay, we need to talk about this, we need to talk about that. It's like, nope, this actually, if the safety or the trust has been broken, that is what we need to then pause on. I think that's where we start avoiding safe spaces just meaning a catch-all, like anyone can say anything. And it's true, I've been in spaces like that, and you walk away feeling more hurt than when you walked in, feeling more judged than when you walked in.
Sure.
And unfortunately, there's still a lot of spaces like that out there. If we don't slow down and say, actually, what do we need to contract with each other? And we might need very different things. And then let's rather talk about those different needs first, rather than making the assumption that I know what you need, you know what I need, and then we just rush forward. Yeah.
Sure. That's good. And just before, earlier you were mentioning something about, the emotional policing. I guess, so there's an element where a safe space tries to say, hey, it's not about emotional policing, but rather it is an environment where we can engage, and there's an element of accountability.
Yeah.
But I guess now when there is an acute lack of awareness, there's a certain sense of aloofness to racial pain or cultural pain. You get a situation where somebody says, as you said earlier, hey, well, I didn't mean it, and I think maybe you can just take us through that. Like, I mean, as a rebuttal, how do we allow a situation where intentionality becomes the barometer for whether there's pain or not? Whether there's culpability or not. And I guess in a church space, it can easily go unchecked because, again, there's this thing of the grace as a catch-all thing. There's got to be grace, and so, but we won't do that for somebody being stabbed and say, you stabbed me. Well, whether you meant it or you didn't mean it, that's immaterial when there's blood on the floor. I need to do something about it, And so in your experience, how has that played out where you find a situation where well-meaning people, and I want to give everybody the benefit of the doubt, would say, no, I did not intend to.
Yeah.
And because I did not intend to, it means I'm not racist. It means I'm not culturally insensitive.
Yeah.
Purely on the basis of the fact that it is not my intention.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that is where I've seen in myself and in other people I've worked with kind of quite a aha moment, like the light bulb goes on to understand the difference, as you described it, between intent and impact.
Sure.
And what sometimes needs to happen is we have to work one-on-one. Sometimes it's not possible in a group context. So sometimes if there has been hurt caused, working with if you want to call them the perpetrator, the person who, kind of either said or did the thing that caused harm, and then working with the person on the receiving end. So helping on both sides understand. So if it's the person who has impacted someone negatively, helping them understand, like you said, it's helpful to actually to use parallels to physical wounds where, it wouldn't make sense to say, but I didn't intend to hurt you, and yet the person's bleeding.
Sure.
So why are we so quick to do that when it comes to emotional and psychological wounding? So I think helping people just slow down and sit with that, but my intent doesn't mean that other person hasn't been harmed.
Sure.
There's really interesting for people. I've seen some people shift when they get it at a heart level. So they think of an experience where they've been impacted and the other person didn't intend it, and suddenly the light bulb goes on, like, oh my word, I was impacted. The other person didn't mean it, but I was hugely affected. And then they can apply that to themselves. So some people need a heart connection to that idea, to that concept, to suddenly shift. Other people, it's helpful to have kind of some cognitive, intellectual tools or resources. And there's some really helpful research out there that has kind of done brain scans that show that the brain actually doesn't differentiate between physical wounding and social wounding or harm. Wow. The brain actually lights up. I'm not a scientist or anything, but this was really helpful for me to actually see the brain scans where it shows that the same part of the brain lights up when a person has been physically wounded as when they've been either socially harmed through racist, sexist, any other kind of slurs, bullying, other kind of social wounding. The brain does not differentiate. And so just having that kind of awareness that, okay, my intent was not this, but the impact on that other person, the brain has received that offense in the same way as if I had physically struck them.
Sure.
So I think that point around intent impact is very helpful. And that's why I think I ended up moving from group facilitation into individual coaching, because I found that to make that shift, some people need the safe space has to become a lot smaller. So a person might need a one-on-one space to work with a coach or a counselor to be able to own the impact, to be able to own some of those words, to own the fact that, wow, if I own up to this, does that mean that I'm racist? Wow. If you don't have that kind of safety to be able, well, why is that term so loaded for me? That term racist, why do I resist it so strongly?
Sure.
It might be because I grew up in a deeply racist family, and I'm trying to differentiate myself from them.
Sure.
And yet, I need to be able to recognize the impact, even if it's unintentional. So I think, and likewise on the side of the person on the receiving end of the hurt, having a safe space to be able to unpack, that maybe that person really didn't intend to hurt you. What does it mean to process your pain, but allow that first before someone else tells you extend grace.
Sure.
Someone else can't tell you to forgive or to extend grace. You have to come to that internal process awareness yourself.
Least of all the perpetrator.
Yes,
it's like
exactly.
The guy comes and stabs you and says, grace, forgive, move on.
Yep.
Whilst they are the very same person that is the source of the pain.
And I think that's what's so painful in many churches, is that the very people who have inflicted the harm are the ones saying, now you must forgive, you must give grace. So, and I've seen this happen even in schools we've worked with, where there's been incidences as well, where interestingly enough, and almost counterintuitively, a lot of the attention goes to the perpetrator. What are we going to do with this person? What are we going to do to help them come to an awareness? What are we going to do to help them recognize where they've gone wrong? And meanwhile, the person who's been on the receiving end, and they'll be sent for counseling, they'll be sent for kind of, what is it called? Remedial kind of interventions.
Sure.
And yet the person who's actually been on the receiving end of the comment or the action are just kind of left there.
Sure.
Like they must just get over it themselves. Whereas they also need to be given that opportunity for, like I said, a smaller safe space with a counselor, a coach, a therapist, someone that they can process and work through. How do I potentially give that person the benefit of the doubt if maybe they didn't intend it? But by giving them the benefit of the doubt, I'm not invalidating my own pain.
Sure.
And that's complex to work through. And it can take months, it can take years of, a very intentional kind of therapy or conversation. And yet so often I think, because the quick response is, forgive and forget and move on, people who have been on the receiving end aren't afforded that opportunity.
Sure.
So.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess all of it's precisely because of the invisible nature of very real pain, and
exactly.
So the challenge, though, is that when we get into the multicultural spaces, is that can I just leave? And I think maybe this is probably the source of it all, is that when I look at my culture, and we were talking before the show started, and you were mentioning when you went to the States, for example, to get married, and the pastor immediately says, "Are you going to have a cultural wedding?" And your immediate response to it, but like everything is cultural. The reason we're here is that my husband can experience American culture, but the challenge or the insidious particles, I don't know what's the right word to use, of racial hurt in cultural spaces often resides in ignorance, or where people have no idea that they have a culture. And so what you do, you think, you know what, I just need to come as I am. And in a sense, yes, we all come as we are. But generally, you find that, depending on where you go, you try and figure out the environment and realize that things may be done differently or whatever the case is. But if I'm not aware that I have a particular cultural disposition, a cultural setting, and living in a South African space, that cultural setting has embedded in it some racial pathologies, about racial views that that reside within me and the things that I do. And so then when I just say I'm going to be in a cultural space, how often does the fact that I am not aware of that stuff, and I don't even see a need to actually introspect, because I've grown up having an internalized level of superiority that whatever I do is right. Whatever I do is salient. Whatever I do is civilized. Whatever I do is backed by scripture, or whatever your mental disposition is. And so wherever I go, therefore means if I just do what I've always been doing, I'll be fine. And so when you come and bring to me that actually what you've been doing all this time actually is racially or culturally insensitive, to what extent that type of ignorant, blind spot, to what extent it is an encumbrance, an hindrance. It hinders us from actually being effective in doing multiculturalism well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's so true. I think you've reminded me of a book that I read years ago that was so eye-opening to me, because I was coming from a culture and very much grew up in a church environment where it was just assumed like our way is the right way.
Sure.
And that was never questioned, and it was never seen as culture. It was just like, this is just the right way to do things.
Sure.
And that had American aspects to it. It had whiteness aspects to it. It had middle class aspects to it. It had many dimensions to it. But I was then introduced to a book, it's by an author. It's written some time ago, an author named Tandeka. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the title is Learning to be White.
Sure.
Now that was fascinating. The title itself caught my attention because it was like, oh, okay, this is something actually that is these are learned behaviors.
Sure.
These are learned cultural attributes. And any culture has things that can be glorifying to God, and any culture has things that need to be redeemed and restored.
Sure.
And so it really just brought in that measure of humility to say, sure, it's not just that everything I've learned is because that's the right way to do it. It does have certain cultural connotations. And then to further kind of unpack and disentangle the difference between race and culture and not too quickly merge those two together has been another whole journey. And that's probably a whole topic for another day.
Yep.
But to be clear in my mind, when is what I'm saying actually very much influenced by race and racial ideology, and when is it influenced by a particular culture, particular heritage, particular ancestry, and how do I understand those two? Again, it goes back to that having language to then talk about some of the differences that we come across. I mean, Mpo and I have had to navigate these even in our own home. You know, is it a right or wrong issue, or is it just your way of doing it and my way of doing it issue? And I think if we see churches also as families, where we have to navigate some of these differences all the time. I think that's the other thing too, is this is not going to be a once-off thing. And I think that's where we also get tripped up when a hurt happens. It's like, okay, let's deal with it, but as long as this never happens again. It is going to happen again. So how do we build resiliency into those church spaces where either one, people don't revert back to that and say, but we dealt with this 3 years ago, so why are we dealing with this again? And just recognizing that it is bound to happen. In fact, some of the teams I work with, I tell them the more diverse you become. Some people, so let me back up. Some people have actually challenged me and said, well, as soon as you introduce these conversations about multiculturalism, diversity, unpacking race and racism, then suddenly all these racial incidences happen. As if it's a cause and effect. And I say, no, they're there all along. It's just when people start feeling safe and free to talk about them, then the real work starts. And sometimes the more diverse a church becomes, the more potential there is for these misunderstandings, either cultural or racial in nature. So so we have to be ready for it and not treat it as, okay, we've done this tick, let's go to the next topic. It's not a topic, it's a lived reality.
And I think, and I love the fact that you use that, I mean, it is a family. You know, the bride of Christ is a family of believers, you know, and we get into, and we don't get to check out of things. And, you know, I love that, you know, you are in a multiracial space. So you have cultural things that you deal with, even within your relationship. I would say the same in my life, where we have to navigate sort of cultural things. And, you know, so every day there's an element where I have to consciously be aware. When am I regressing to my natural cultural disposition? When am I trying or being active in trying to bridge the gap and trying to create a situation where we continuously live in a loving environment? And, you know, and so, you know, I love it when you say it's not a once-off thing. And I guess it does answer that initial question of why can't we just move on? And I guess when we realize that we are a family, and this family is not just a temporal family here, it is an eternal family. It's either we learn today to get along racially, or either way, in heaven, that sanctification must still continue, where we learn that as long as we are God's children together, there is going to be continuous wrestling, continuous working. You know, and I think the sooner we get that into our minds, then the rhetoric, this, I'm tired of culture discussion, I'm tired of this thing, you know, it displays, it betrays somebody's poverty in understanding what it means to live in a multicultural space, what it means to be in a family, what it means to love like Jesus Christ loves. And I think, you know, one of the things we haven't mentioned and touched on, somebody listening now is saying, yeah, I hear you guys, you just sound like some people, you know, elsewhere that I've heard, you know, who speak about this stuff, you know, but what does this have to do with the gospel? What does this have to do with Christ? You know, I mean, why don't we just forget about what we're talking about now in the way that we've discussed it and people learning things? Why don't we just love God and forget about discussing these things?
Sure. Yeah, that's a challenging one, because I think it's rather than an either or, and often it's approached like that. There's either this approach of like, let's just focus on loving God, focus on reading our Bibles and just doing what the Word says, and all these other things will be sorted out. And on the other side, it's, but how do we work out our salvation in fear and trembling and
Sure.
on a daily basis? What does that love actually look like? And making sure that we're not being hypocrites. As I was thinking about this topic, I was taken to the story of the Good Samaritan. And those guys who walked past that guy on the side of the road, they certainly would have said, well, we love God.
Sure. That's good.
We love him with our
Sure.
whole heart, mind,
Yeah,
soul.
Yeah.
And yet they walked past a stranger in need.
Wow.
So what is going on there? That's so convicting to me.
Sure.
So convicting to me on a daily basis. Again, using the family example, I can be harboring deep resentment towards my husband, towards my kids, towards my friends, towards my extended family. And yet if someone asks me point blank, but Jennie, you're a Christian, do you love God? I would say, yeah, I love God with
Sure.
wholeheartedly.
Sure.
But I'm not living it in terms of that working out of, in terms of the relationships in my life. And it's been a puzzle to me. I'll be honest, Temba. I've struggled with it. I've gone to God and asked him, like, God, why is this thing so deep in churches?
Sure.
Surely your blood is powerful enough.
Sure.
But then everything else that we experience in churches, and this is where I come back to, is why do we treat racial conflict or pain or hurt differently? It's been acknowledged that divorce happens in churches, other forms of harm happen in churches. So certainly that points to the fact that loving God is not enough in terms of sorting out all of our
That's good.
human relational problems. And so you have to love God, but then love your neighbor as yourself. And what that looks like in practice, I think, is an ongoing daily work.
Sure.
And that has really, and sometimes I ask God, I'm like, sure, I think the reason he brought me into this field of work is because he knew I would need to practice it every single day of my life. And that's part of his restorative, redeeming work in me, I hope, and I believe, and I'm grateful for his grace and patience with me in my life. But yeah, so I guess that's how I would respond in that case of saying, well, can't we just focus on the gospel, focus on loving God? But Jesus, in his short few years on this earth, he was constantly navigating, guiding, teaching on relationships and how to bridge gaps and divisions. He didn't just go to people and say, well, just love God and everything else will be sorted out.
Sure. That's powerful. Yeah, that's powerful because I guess it does bring us into that thing of, love God with everything, but love your neighbors yourself. And I'm convicted that my capacity and my ability to love somebody else is a reflection of how I love God.
Sure.
And I think sometimes we have created an ungodly disconnect where we say, you know what, who cares? People are just collateral in some of my pursuits of loving God, not realizing that Jesus Christ came into the world for people. He didn't come for anything else, but he came for people, and every single human being is created in his image. And when the love of God saturates my heart, the natural outworking of that is how I treat his children, how I treat his people. If he shows me that these are the people I'm willing to die for, what does it cost me to understand the racial dynamics, to understand cultural settings and dispositions, so that I can love somebody else better? And I think, and it's easy again to discuss it when it comes to a marriage, that in a marriage, for me, I need to understand and learn and know my wife better. The reason I do that, they even talk about the 5 love languages and so on, is simply so that I can be more effective at showing them love. And yet, when it comes to this topic, it's disassociated. And I think one of the things is how over the years is that when there was, whether it was apartheid in South Africa, slavery in America, the only way you could make sense with the gospel was to divorce to separate the political things that play out and my personal relationship with God. And that's the only way I could do it with a clean conscience, and that's the only way I could still have a slave or oppress somebody else, whether it's a law that justifies it or not. It cannot be reconciled to Scripture. And so it is also a culture, that it is a sinful aspect of a cultural heritage that can love God and I hate you.
Yep.
And even though I don't call it hating you, I just call it we equal, but I treat you differently. We're the same. But you can't eat next to me.
Yep.
I can't invite you to my house. I can't, I don't really need to learn that much about you. Do your thing, I do my thing, and so on. And I think maybe as we part ways, and it lends us to the whole thing of the economics of it. That how do we relate economics? And again, there's an aspect of the individual's role in it, but also the very real systemic things that contribute to the socio-economic imbalance that plays itself out within our cultural spaces within churches.
Yeah. And what you're reminding me of too is this false dichotomy, or this also separation that's been put in place through many, many years of, I guess, just conditioning or avoidance, but that sets up, you can pursue social justice and pursue as a cause, as separate from pursuing, bringing people to Christ.
Sure.
I've often been challenged on that, as if they're separate.
Yeah.
And it was never like that in the gospel.
Never.
So pursuing economic justice, pursuing freedom, pursuing all those things that we need in our world right now is not either contradictory, it's not in opposition to us bringing the word to people. And yeah, I think one of the reasons I suspect why in many church spaces and faith-based organizations, why there's so much defensiveness around this is because if we actually owned up to some of the history, it's deeply painful.
Sure.
I mean, I grew up in a missionary environment. Missions, the whole history of missions is complicated. That could also be a topic for another day.
Yep.
Because it was, I can go out and be blind. And this is not true for all missions. Like some missions really focus very holistically. But, I can go out and just preach the gospel, save people's souls, but at the same time, they're being oppressed because of the racial and social system. And in my mind, like you said, how historically that could have been true is it had to have just been separated, divorced from each other. Whereas the two, I think if the church could really grapple with and wrestle with that they are not separate and they are not at odds with each other.
Sure.
In fact, the more we can love people in in the needs that exist, in the issues of justice and inequality, the more we are giving them a pathway to encounter Christ's love.
Sure.
So...
Sure.
Yeah, it's
powerful.
It's one very close to my heart. So thank you for bringing that aspect.
And I wish we had more time to engage on it. But and again, in a cultural setting, there is one culture that is endowed with a lot of wealth, historically speaking. Yeah. And whilst we're not dismissing the individual aspects, that yes, you will find people who squander their wealth. You would find people who do have a poverty mindset, and all and that kind of stuff at an individual level. But we cannot ignore the systemic nature at which people have found themselves in. And so at a cultural discussion, even the culture of economics, the discussion of economics needs to be filtered there for us to be completely holistic.
Yeah.
Because again, the reason I can be very individualistic and very inward focused, very, very insular in how I do church is because I have it all. I have food. I have time to go out on a holiday and do that and do that and do that. But do I ponder to think of somebody else within my space that they weren't given the same opportunities? They've got a historical baggage of whether in our South African context, whether it's black tax, whether it's no access to education or whatever the case is. How do I show love in a way to say, hey, I can go on a holiday today. I know you can't. Yeah. But as part of me loving you, I'm not talking about feeding a charity, because that's another thing we often do, is that, no, I give money to a charity. So as to abdicate my personal interrelational responsibilities of loving one another in this space, to be able to say, hey, yes, I give to a charity, and don't hear what I'm not saying. It is a good thing, God-honoring thing. But within a church space, is there a need for us, whilst we're in the cultural discussion, to understand the cultural economics, which are a byproduct of the cultural setup, which is systemic within South Africa.
Yeah. Sure. And I think that's where, again, going back for me to the idea of we are a family, it shifts it completely. Because, right now, one of my huge learnings and awareness over 15 years of being married into a family with like massive economic differences within the same family is how in a family you have to navigate, like, you don't stop inviting people to the family gatherings because you think, oh, they can't afford to bring.
Sure, that's good.
You see, okay, how can I maintain their dignity and their honor, but cover for them where they can't? In a way that is not patronizing. And yeah, many families don't get it right. I'm blessed to be married into a family that I've just seen that level of support and care. And then what's amazing, in fact, we were on a recent trip, and one of, and to see other family members when they are then in a position to step up, how much joy there is to say, now I can contribute something. So I have this dream and this vision of the church being like that. Whereas rather than it's these like awkward dynamics of, if we're more diverse socioeconomically, then people are going to need more and they're going to ask me of things and it's going to be awkward. If we see ourselves as this family, and a family that can help bring healing for those broken places, broken by poverty, broken by unemployment, broken in so many ways, rather than, again, that splinter, which can just be dug in deeper if someone feels excluded because they don't have enough money, or feels talked down to because they don't come wearing the nicest of clothes. But if instead we can see this as an amazing opportunity for corporate healing, like can happen in a family, to me, I think that's the power of Christ at work in our midst. He had the capacity when he was on earth, to navigate the spaces with the greatest wealth and where there was the greatest need. And I think maybe one last thing to mention, and I think you alluded to it, and it goes back to what can help shift some of the conversations is being conscious. Again, I think it's rooted culturally, but awareness of kind of individualistic perspective on the world versus collective. So if I see every individual as being responsible for their own, like, have they been able, I grew up with this narrative, been able to kind of achieve and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and just make it in life. And therefore I judge them if they haven't. That's why having this systemic perspective, this on like what has happened in this country and in many countries, helps me then come into those conversations with much more humility. So again, if I've said something that's hurtful because I'm making a judgment or an assumption, I see it as, it's not that individual, it's actually the system that has created it. So what collective responsibility we then have to, not to heal a system, to correct a system, but to hopefully heal the individual's experience in the meantime.
No, that's good. And I think that the last question is then, I think maybe it's a two-part question. How then can we, and I think you've answered it in part, the sense of that, how do we continuously strive for healing, and then how do we do multiculturalism within our churches?
I would love to hear some of your thoughts on this, Temba, too. So feel free to jump in. But it's a big question. How do we do multiculturalism well? So, I think partly is, how can the Bible also instruct us? Like what tools does it provide? And so I think the one that we've already touched on, I think really for us to meditate and be very honest before God on how well we're loving our neighbor. So I think that's a starting point, and daily loving our neighbor. And like you were saying, and that loving our neighbor doesn't mean just giving to charity, although that is a good thing, but making sure that it's in the relational. So I think, and really questioning ourselves on who is my neighbor? Who do I see as my neighbor? Am I willing to, in a multicultural space, to step into the awkwardness of maybe there's a language barrier that doesn't feel comfortable, but am I willing to go there? And I think it's kind of, I guess doing multiculturalism well means being a little bit more comfortable with discomfort.
Sure.
With it's not always going to go smoothly. It's going to have a few bumps, and and then I think certainly as we've already been speaking about, going always back to the role model of Christ and his words, his actions, his gift of reconciling. There was another book that had a big impact on me called The Wounded Healer.
Sure.
And so how did Jesus in his own wounding provide a space of healing for others? So I think for the church, for multicultural churches to really, when things feel like almost impossible, like I said earlier, sometimes I sit and I think, how will healing ever happen? I feel very hopeless. But then the verse that I've been sitting with to inspire hope, because I think multicultural churches also, to do it well, they need to always find that place of hope again when it feels like this just isn't working. And so that verse in Isaiah 53, where it says, surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, and the punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed.
Sure.
When I'm like deeply discouraged by our own, what we as humans do to each other, I go back and find solace in that. And then certainly also, thank goodness that in the church we have prayer. And I feel like maybe as multicultural churches, we need to pray not just for the visible things that need healing, although sometimes, people pray, there's prayer for healing, but it's for physical ailments. And I was sitting wondering, like, what if we prayed more for those invisible wounds?
That's good.
Prayer as both a tool for healing, prayer as a conversation with God, a lament, prayer as a protection over churches. Because I really believe that churches that truly embark on this journey of multiculturalism, anti-racism, anti-sexism, all these things are going to come under attack. So how do we, that verse in Philippians 4, how do we guard our hearts and our minds in Christ Jesus while we're on this journey together? I think that's another one. And that guarding of our hearts and minds, I was sitting and making sure that what we see as outward evidence of the journey, that we don't look for the wrong thing. I hope I'm making sense. So I was sitting with the notion of peace, and that shalom, is not the absence. I actually have this written up on my desk to remind me every day. And it says, shalom is not the absence of conflict, but a state of rightness and well-being that only comes from God.
Man, sure.
So I think multicultural churches, to get it well, also must not just be looking for, okay, we don't have any more conflict, now we good. It's that state of corporate wellness, well-being in God. So those are a few thoughts. I'm curious if you have.
Sure.
Oh, maybe, let me add one more. And that is just for multicultural churches to get it well, really sitting, and it's a verse that you mentioned earlier, actually, about in Galatians, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus.
Yep.
Now, it's interesting because I've heard a lot of Christians go just to the last part, we're all one in Christ Jesus, without acknowledging the first part, which actually names some of our differences and names some of the wounding that was present even in that society back then, where there was slavery. And so it's that, how do we restore the dignity of every person in God's eyes as part of acknowledging that oneness?
Sure.
And I think multicultural churches need to work hard to say, even in our leadership teams, is everyone represented there, or is it only the well-educated?
Sure.
Is it only those who have kind of made it in the eyes of men that are represented there?
Sure.
Let me pause there.
No, that's good. That's power. That's power. That's power. No, thank you so much. And I don't want to add too much in that, but I think there's so many things that you are challenging us there, of how, like naming some of those differences, the wounding, like the wounded healer, which is Jesus Christ, that through his wounds we were healed. And it's so appropriate within us or within our spaces where there's so much wounding, that we can always draw strength from the Christ. And I also love you mentioned that shalom is not the absence of challenges, but just that whole thing that we're doing this thing with God. We're not just doing it by ourselves. What does the peace of God mean in this very confused, diverse space? And so, like living with the tension. And never saying, move on, I'm tired, and that kind of thing. If you move on and tired, then heaven is potentially not for you, because the point is we are being refined to a point that one day God says every nation, every tongue, there will be just this big sort of multicultural explosion of worship before the throne of the King, and so we're getting, a first dress rehearsal of those moments. I thought, that was power, and I think I've thoroughly enjoyed that, and I hope the listeners have enjoyed it. Before we end our episode, I want to ask you to just give us any parting shots.
Sure. Well, being someone who loves to read, I thought also I'll just mention a few. People always ask me this question, like, what can I read up more on this? So there's a few things that I would just say they've really helped me in the journey. There are things that I go back to frequently. And they touch on different aspects of this conversation. So it was helpful, even prepping for this, to think about what were some of those useful things that I've read along the way. One, actually, before I ever came to South Africa, was Desmond Tutu's No Future Without Forgiveness.
Sure.
And that book really, really impacted me a lot. Themba, I think your book, I really want to appreciate that you've put it out into the world, because I think what it does is it shows the honesty and truth that's needed around both individual histories and also collective and societal histories and wounding. And until we can have more kind of honest reckoning and say, well, what is this past? What is this present that has been so hurtful? So that truth-telling is critical. So anyone who has not read Themba's book, Village Boy, please read it. A few others, I mentioned trauma right at the beginning, and I know we haven't had much time to talk about trauma, but there's a book that has been, actually it's on my reading list, so I haven't read it yet, but some of my colleagues who I work very closely with highly recommend it, and it's Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies.
Sure.
And even the title alone gives you a sense of what it's about. And then one more book on trauma, which is Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. So those are, as a parting shot for anyone who's out there who's like, but I want more. I want to read more. I want to know more. That's out there for anyone. Maybe my other parting thought, Themba, is just a real word of validation to anyone listening to this podcast who has felt deeply wounded in church spaces, in faith-based organizations. I just want to say your pain is real. Often you probably have been told that it's not. And I just really want to invite you to keep on the journey that Christ will bring you to spaces of healing. So I think I'll stop there.
No, thank you so much. And if you're listening, I tell you what, I've got my homework. I've got, my Kindle is going to be loaded with some of those books. I can't wait to dive into them, because ultimately we need to be better than who we were yesterday. And the more we read, the more we get into spaces that we've never been to before. And books become that privilege that is offered to us to say, let me journey in different perspectives that I can't as a singular individual be able to have, and use the collective wisdom of all those people who've gone before us and have engaged thoroughly and rigorously with some of the topics. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for the shout out to Village Boy. I didn't pay Jenny anything, by the way, but hey, no, I truly and I thoroughly appreciate it. And I have been enriched, and I trust that you listening have been empowered and enriched. And I pray that God would continue to walk this journey of healing and reconciliation, that we can get healed if you've been hurt, as Jennie was saying, but ultimately that in our multicultural spaces they may continue to glorify God as we're serving together. With those words, I want to say to you, sa laniga hle. Until next time, cheers, bye-bye.
Thanks.